Hi, this is William Henderson,
And this is McGraw.
and this is the Unjerked podcast. So, our podcast essentially takes a look at common things people talk about on the internet, and we take a closer look. So, this is part 2 of our episode on healthcare costs. So, do you want to talk about some of these arguments you saw online?
Sure. I think a lot of it boils down to some people saying it's too free market and some people saying it's not free market enough. And I think the underlying, a lot of one word comments are it's greed, it's capitalism. But basically, you could make the argument that healthcare is kind of highway robbery. Like, you're dying unless you get this surgery or medicine, like you would basically pay whatever. So, it seems logical that some people would take advantage of that and charge a lot of money. And then not free market enough, people might say, oh yes, all these regulations and things are really making it really difficult and expensive to do any sort of pharmaceuticals or medical devices, or even just like administratively running a hospital. I mean, I imagine like if there wasn't a lot of regulations, like running a hospital would be way cheaper, because I bet you most admin work has to do with following the law. But also that feels like a thing that you would want to be regulated to some degree. So I don't know where that balance is. So you see a lot of that on there. I saw one I hadn't seen before. Someone said that the cost is all theater, as in the price on paper is really, really, really high, so that the insurance companies could like negotiate down the deal and make it look like they're saving you a ton of money. But while like if you like ask like, okay, what's the non-insurance price, it would be like way less. But I'm pretty sure that if you went outside of insurance, like just at some generic hospital, like unless you're getting like a flu shot or something, it'd be pretty expensive. So I don't know how true that is. That was a new argument that I saw today. This one I hear a lot is that there's not a lot of transparency on the cost, because you just like give them your insurance. There's like a huge number or whatever, but you don't care because you just have that $5 copay. So like no one really cares about the price at all. Since it's close to the 2024 U.S. election, I'll say the immigrants. They're just taking up all of our health services. I'm sure plenty of people think that right now. One I hear a lot on other podcasts and things is that there's no emphasis on preventative measures. The woke mob is stopping us from doing any body shaming, and no one's doing any effort to have people live a healthier lifestyle, or whatever conspiracy about the FDA approving food and drugs that like should not be approved, that's basically killing us. I will say though, like I have heard a lot that like in healthcare practice, like a lot of people will be told by doctors, just like, you really should diet and exercise more, which would probably fix a lot of their problems, but I could also just give you this pill. And they're like, yeah, I know you're not going to diet or exercise, so here's the pill, but I wish you would just diet and exercise. That feels like that might be, I don't know if anyone's studied that. I'm sure they have. We've already started talking about that a little bit, but everyone always argues about doctors get paid too much, or admin gets paid too much, or whatever. Which there's a lot of arguments on why, and yeah, we'll get to that later. That's a huge one, because doctors do make a lot. Same with the admin, but they kind of have to just from the insurance alone. Also, we kind of already touched on this, but the objective of the healthcare industry in America is for profit, not they have profit objectives, not health objectives. Their goal is to make money, not to make everyone healthy. And then I had to I almost missed one. Some people, I think a lot of people believe this, honestly, is that insurance is inherently a scam. It doesn't really work unless you're the sucker. Otherwise, they wouldn't make money off of people. And then,
So
yeah,
is that
you
it?
got. Oh no, I got a couple more. We have
Okay.
we have to have the mention of the classic meme. They feed us poison, which picture of hamburgers and hot dogs, so we buy their cures, all the big pharma pharmaceuticals, while they suppress our medicine, which normally is a picture of weed. But I found one with I think it's that Four Loco alcoholic energy drink. So I thought that one was like the best form of that meme. But I think a lot of there's a lot of quote unquote woo woo people that are like, oh yeah, well if they let us do like the unapproved medicines that are never going to pass a double blind study, then we would have way cheaper healthcare. Like if weed was something that could fix your diabetes, sure, whatever. I don't know. But also I think a lot of people think that our American diets are like slowly poisoning all of us. So and just it's so profitable to just treat metabolic disease. I think there's a lot of conspiracies floating around right now from all the insulin prices and Ozempic and all that. Oh, and this is a classic one for the universal healthcare haters, is that if you had universal healthcare, it would, quote unquote, create an infinite supply for everyone of healthcare, which would create infinite demand, and then it would just like, explode on itself. Revenge of the hypochondriacs, who just like, oh, I need that full body scan. I think something was off yesterday. So
Yeah, that one's
that's,
so that one there's some nuance. So not all
I think most
not
of these have some nuance to them, to be
yeah.
honest.
Well, so one, a lot of taxpayer funded systems, they don't, so if they don't have out of pocket expenses, you can't use price to because price is usually a mechanism for allocating a scarce resource. So instead, they'll use something like time or
Yeah.
something like that. And so wait times are actually longer in some of these
That is
countries.
something people bring up a lot is, in Canadian universal healthcare, you have these crazy long wait times compared to American healthcare.
Right. But also, a lot of universal systems don't necessarily, they're not necessarily free. Some of them still, you have to do copays and things like that. And so it's not entirely free. Anyways, I'll quickly go through these. So highway robbery. So that's sort of true in the sense that healthcare. So in economics, it's called the elasticity of supply and demand. So if something is inelastic, then if the price changes, demand will not shift that much. And that tends to happen with things that are critical for survival. So well, not food as much. I think with food, there's a supply is very elastic, so that fixes the problem. But on the demand side, water, is an example. Healthcare is a certain example. Is it a market failure if something has too inelastic of a demand curve? That's an argument that some people make. Too many regulations, admin costs. I mean, that's definitely true. You can make an argument that the U.S. healthcare system has like the worst parts of both government and private
That's kind of what
systems.
I've always believed.
Yeah. The cost is all theater. So we can talk about that. So in practice, that's not completely true because of the GDP spend I mentioned earlier. We actually are spending more, but there is some price, the pharmacy benefit managers, the PBMs, they do go through that kabuki dance essentially, where they try to like bring down the price through rebates. No transparency on costs. That's quite true. Immigrants, I don't know. I mean, I don't think that's. I find that hard to believe. Maybe
Well, to steel man that, as some people say, with all of the undocumented immigrants or whatever in America right now, if they're all working under the table, they probably aren't paying for healthcare. or how,
Well,
or would
so
they even get it?
typically when people don't have health insurance, typically what they do is they avoid going to the doctor until things get really bad, and then they go to urgent care or they go to an emergency room.
Yeah,
That's kind of what happens. And then there's a Hippocratic oath obligation, basically, to
yeah,
care for someone. I just my from researching illegal immigration, my perception is that people in that status typically do whatever they can to avoid, basically stirring things up in the system. So they try, we mentioned in the previous episode, they tend to commit crimes at a lower rate because they don't want to get arrested and deported usually. Um, so I imagine, I don't know this for sure, but I imagine something similar probably applies in healthcare, where unless they really have to get healthcare, they're probably not waltzing into the doctor's office all the time. Um, in terms of preventative measures, there is truth to that. We'll talk about that later. Doctors getting paid too much. Doctors do get paid a healthy amount in the U.S. There's some nuance around that we'll talk about. Profit motivated, not health motivated. I mean, I think a lot of the issues still apply in nonprofit hospitals too. So I think that's a bit of a simplistic argument. Insurance is a scam. Try not having insurance and see how bad things get when your house gets destroyed or whatever. I think insurance is very important. The issues are diet, so there is some truth to that we'll talk about. Anyways, so to kind of go over the market failures, essentially the healthcare system has a lot of market failures in it, and markets are things that have to be designed sometimes. If you have a simple bazaar or farmer's market, obviously you just show up with your wares and you sell apples or whatever, and it's a pretty efficient market, not very complex. But sometimes, I think markets don't exist in a vacuum. Like corporations are government sanctioned entities. They're not owned by the government, but they exist within the framework set by the government. S corps, C corps, LLCs, they all have certain liability protections, and they have to do meetings a certain number of times, and they have to have a certain structure in terms of board structure. Like there's a lot of rules around that. So they're not like organizations that exist outside of the context of the government. They are defined legally through usually state law, usually Delaware, interestingly. And so the same applies to markets. Sometimes markets don't work. Sometimes they fail. A big reason is information asymmetry. So if one party to a transaction doesn't have a lot of information, that can cause problems. Opaque pricing certainly applies to healthcare. How much does an X-ray cost? How much does it cost?
I have no idea, but I imagine
Yeah,
I don't know
either.
Out of pocket. Yeah,
I don't know either.
you don't walk up to a hospital and they have like a bright neon light of all the prices,
or
like a McDonald's.
not just the price of, pick your procedure or whatever, but like what is the cost that goes into providing it? Because obviously, price is cost plus a profit, right? Usually. So how much does it cost? What is, when you get an X-ray, the cost is obviously there's a technician who does the X-ray for you, and they get paid a salary. So that's part of the cost. There's also the depreciation of the equipment. So the equipment, as far as accounting goes, is depreciated over a certain period of time, and that goes into the cost. But like, how much does that cost? Nobody knows. I'm sure some people might know, like hospital, finance people might know, but like 99% of people have no idea what the actual expenses are.
Yeah, and I mean, also, you find out the expenses afterwards. Hopefully your insurance pays for most of it. It's not like you're walking up to the emergency room with a broken arm. You're like, all right, I got a broken arm. I think what's the cost going to look like? And it's, they're like, well, it's going to be about $3,000 ago. All right, well, I'm going to check a few other emergency rooms out to see which one's going to be cheaper here. Might be back. No one's price shopping.
Yeah. Well, the prices are not advertised, and a lot of times, if you're in a emergency situation, you don't have the luxury of even doing that shopping.
No, not an emergency
Yeah.
situation.
And then also patients don't know like what makes someone a good doctor, what makes a certain medical treatment the right treatment. Like nobody knows. There's a couple there are websites that rate doctors and whatnot, like the sort of Yelp for doctors. But my experience has been that very few people actually participate in those rating systems. And so it's like here are the 6 dentists or the 6, you know, orthopedic surgeons or whatever in your area, and it's like, none of them have ratings because nobody bothers to rate them. And so when like I cannot, if I was told like here are the 6 doctors for this procedure in your area, which of them is the best, there's no way I don't have the expertise to answer that question. I just don't know. um and there's no real track record of like other people saying like, oh, this doctor did a bad job on my surgery. Like that's not really information that you have access to, generally speaking. um, Quality metrics for health systems and doctors, they're not really a huge thing as far as I know. So like which hospitals are good? Did people have good experiences? Which doctors did people have good experiences with? You usually don't know. And which doctors are in network, so which doctors are part of your health insurance system, you don't know, or you can find out, but it's quite difficult and time consuming to find out. And so you might accidentally end up getting a doctor out of network and like have to pay a lot of money for that. And then patients might not know how much healthcare coverage they have under their health insurance system or their health insurance program. And so when it comes to like, there's very massive information asymmetry in healthcare where like you kind of don't really know what's on the other side as a patient, right?
Yeah. Oh, no,
Um,
no clue. Who knows?
and then steep demand curves. So you kind of have to say yes to paying for something because if you're in an emergency situation, you have no choice.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it's not an immediate emergency, it's very difficult to say no to healthcare where otherwise you might die or you might get severely disabled. And then also, there's a massive difference in bargaining power between providers, patients, drug companies, etc. So I've mentioned this before. It's called Porter's Five Forces, but it looks at the different, people within a market, the competitors, competitors, vendors, customers, etc. And the bigger the power gap is, the more likely it is that the other party will get more of the money. And this is why unionization is a good way for people, for workers to make more money, because when workers form a union, they have it increases their bargaining collectively, and it increases their power relative to their employer, right? If you're a giant company and you're bargaining with one individual, then obviously that individual is going to make less money. But if you have like 30,000 people all bargaining together, they just have more bargaining power. And typically in healthcare, the patient has very little power. And so that's another huge issue. And then there's negative externalities. And this is an argument for why I think universal healthcare is good for society as a whole. Is there are negative downsides to people getting sick, even if it's not yourself. Infectious disease can spread to other people, obviously, but also sick
Mm-hmm.
people are less productive. So they're less likely to be working. And so that's less tax money coming in. That's less, goods and services being produced, etc. So why don't these problems happen to other vital industries? So there's water, shelter, food, um, emergency services, etc. Frankly, most vital industries are regulated to a large degree. The absolutely free market typically does not exist for most vital industries. It does exist for things like coffee, like going to a coffee shop or buying toys for
Yeah,
Christmas or whatever.
but that's not vital.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but most life essentials are not completely free markets. They either it's provided by the government, usually local government, or they're regulated monopolies, or the provider. There's a large number of providers, so it reduces the bargaining power of the sellers, or there's government subsidies, etc. So water, those are usually utilities. So, when people say, well, if government controls your healthcare, then they can use that against you. And my response is like, what would happen? How would you react if the government controlled your water supply? Trick question. They already do. So, there's that. And then
I got to use that on somebody.
And then, energy. Usually there's more private utilities in energy, but they're typically regulated. Food, there's a lot of intervention in terms of stabilizing prices. And that's an episode we should do later. Also, there's a very large number of providers. There's farmers. There's a large number of farmers. So that reduces their bargaining power versus customers. Shelter, there's the zoning issue I mentioned. So there is a problem there that's caused by too much regulation. But there's a large number of vendors with shelter. Education is mostly provided by the government in K through 12. Even most colleges are owned by the government, or at least half of them are. But there's private options too. Transportation, roads are almost all roads are owned by the government. You have to be licensed by the government to operate a vehicle on a road, etc. Emergency services are mostly government owned. Police, firefighters, etc. So frankly, like most, life essentials do not operate as free markets. They oftentimes they do exist as markets, but they are regulated markets. And a lot of times they're provided directly by local governments, Let's dig into the meat of why prices are high. So when it comes to drug prices, until very recently, the government was not allowed to negotiate drug prices with drug companies in terms of Medicare. So Medicare, so in 2023, they started moving away from this. And so Medicare.gov talks about this. There's a couple new medications that are now going to be lower cost for insulin, out-of-pocket drugs and they listed 10 drugs. And I'm not going to name all of them because, drugs always have silly names. But they finally started doing direct negotiations for prices.
Do they get those names from? Those are
I don't know. But like in 2023, for the first time, the government Medicare started negotiating drug prices, and this is like, as far as I could tell, reading about it, like purely a lobbying effort. That for so long, pharmaceutical companies basically got to just list, they're like, this is the price, and the government had to basically take it. Because most government contracts involve price negotiations. Outside of pharmaceuticals. So, if the government's buying, XYZ, or frankly, if a private company, because when it comes to like small ticket items, like if you go to the grocery store, you're not going to like negotiate the price of apples. You're not going to haggle at Albertsons or whatever. But when it comes to like bigger ticket contracts, usually organizations do negotiations. So if a school is like buying some sort of software system from a vendor, they'll, a lot of times they'll negotiate. They're like, hey, this price doesn't seem right to me. Let's talk about it, etc. And so in my mind, like negotiating prices is a very natural part of markets and just economics. It's just a basic thing. So I just thought it was crazy that until last year, like basically all drugs, the government just had to accept the price they were given.
That's so nuts that just got changed.
And only for 10 drugs so far.
Wow.
Only for 10 drugs. So
Dang.
most drugs, they still have to accept what they're given. And other countries negotiate prices. And so other countries, they get lower prices, much, sometimes even 10 times lower prices for the same drugs. One argument you can make is
but that's the government though. Like we're like private insurance companies not doing this either.
Well, so Medicare is the biggest payer in the US, and so they kind of had the most power. And so if Medicare is not negotiating smaller health insurance systems, they just don't have the leverage to the same degree to really negotiate effectively. So typically the other systems where they have, the sort of mandatory insurance models or the national insurance model, et cetera, like there is a direct negotiation between the government and the drug companies. And when you have a single payer, you have more bargaining power and you have a greater ability to drive prices down in negotiations. There's an argument made by the industry that I think is valid to a degree. So essentially in investing, standard rule of thumb is like the higher risk something is, the better return you should get to get compensated for that risk. And developing a drug is very, very expensive. It can cost more than $1 billion.
I think that's one of the primary reasons like they get so expensive in the first place.
Yeah, actually,
just to prove that a drug is safe is really expensive.
Yeah, like synthesizing a molecule is not the hard part. The hard part is going through all the preclinical trials and the clinical trials. It's a very rigorous process.
Yeah,
and there is an argument. So essentially, the U.S. U.S. patients subsidize to a large degree the global drug market. A massive percentage, even drug companies based in other continents, a large percentage of their revenues come from U.S. patients. And there is an argument, if you negotiated down drug prices, maybe there'd be less drugs being developed. That's a possibility.
I've always heard that one. I didn't write down that circle jerk argument. So I already saw you already had that on there.
But the idea of one country largely subsidizing an entire global industry, I just don't like that. And I think, if you negotiate prices down, I mean, in my mind, it's like, well, that's just part of commerce, is like you negotiate things. So, is it worth it? Let's say it does reduce the number of drugs going to market every year, but people pay much, much less for drugs.
Well, is there a cheaper way of finding out if drugs are safe? Like, is there a cheaper testing procedure?
I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I don't have the background to answer that, but it's a question.
Yeah.
Drugs, you have to prove that they're both safe and effective. Is it possible to you're actually not allowed to sell a drug that for sure is safe, and you're like 80% sure it works, but we haven't done the test yet. You can't actually sell it. And so there's a lot of drugs.
You can't. And honestly, there should be some amount of, yes, I would like to know that the drugs are safe to use at least, but effective, hopefully. Otherwise, I don't want to pay all this money. But
yeah,
I think a lot of people are questioning that these days. Like, I've heard some, I think on some of the long form woo-woo podcasts about how you can't even, one of the reasons why you can't even do the psychedelics testing is how do you double blind study psychedelics when it's incredibly obvious if you're on it or not?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the issues. I think there needs to be some talk about better ways of proving the safe and efficacy of drugs, which I don't know how you do it, because that sounds really difficult, since there's so many variables to control for, and so many things that can go wrong when people take drugs. I don't know how you do it. But also just that large cost probably keeps a lot of people from entering the market.
Yeah. So there's that. And then pharmacy benefit managers. So they're essentially middlemen who negotiate drug prices on behalf of insurance companies. So they don't really exist in most countries. They do exist in the US, and they basically get paid based on a rebate. So they negotiate. So I guess this is a form of negotiations you see on the private market. But I think the issue, so it says a brief look at current debates about pharmacy benefit managers by Brookings Institute. And a few points. So it's a very concentrated market. 3 firms have 79% market share: CVS Health, Optum Rx, and Express Scripts. Have almost 80% market share over PBMs. They also get paid based on rebates. And so you could argue, does that lead to an incentive to start out with a super high drug price and then negotiate a very large rebate? And even though the end dollar figure that the insurance pays for might be low, what does that do to people who don't have insurance? Because if you don't have insurance, you'd have to pay for the full price. So there's an argument that like this could incentivize higher and higher sticker prices for drugs. There's also a question of
that was that circle jerk argument about it being all theater.
Right, but for people who don't have insurance, they do.
Yeah,
you'd have to pay everything.
Yeah,
and if you can't afford it, then you can't use that drug. And so, like, there was that story, that thing I keep seeing on Reddit, where this guy died because he couldn't afford his insulin, and he tried to ration his insulin, and he died, and he was like in his 20s.
Oh my god.
Yeah, so and then there's this paper that talked about whether or not, whether or not PBMs actually contributed to high drug prices. So I just kind of wonder, what exactly is the purpose of PBMs? Because it seems like other countries largely, this function, a lot of it is done by the government, where they negotiate these prices. Also, are there conflicts of interest? So CVS Health is a PBM, but it's also a pharmacy, right? Optum RX is owned by United Health, which also owns insurance and clinics. Express Scripts is owned by Cigna Health, which also does insurance. So PBMs are a thing. And then another thing is fee for service versus paying for value. And there's an article, or there's a chapter of this article, Key Components of National Health Insurance Systems, from the Encyclopedia of Health Economics. And essentially, fee for service is the main model in the US of how payment happens. So basically, for each procedure, you get paid, right? So it's like, hey, we'll do this scan, we'll do this surgery, we'll do this test. For each of those, the doctor and the hospital get a payment. Any possible issues there that you can think of?
They would probably want to do more services.
Yeah. And yeah. I think this probably is not done nefariously. Like, I think it probably happens at a subconscious level, where a doctor might be like, hey, I kind of wonder if like this other issue might be happening. So maybe it wouldn't hurt to like do an extra scan just to kind of make sure, the patient's fine. And the reality is, even though there is a Hippocratic oath, if there's a financial incentive to do unnecessary scans, there will be doctors who do that.
Totally.
It's just human nature. And so it is a system that incentivizes, essentially waste, scans that are not necessary, procedures that are not necessary. An alternative model is called pay for value, where where basically doctors and hospitals get paid based off the value they provide. It's tricky to measure this, but basically a good, one theoretical way of doing it is like baselining each patient based off of their, healthcare history, and saying, hey, does this person get better in treatment compared to someone who does not get treatment, or compared to the average of someone who gets treatment, of somebody in this condition. But essentially, they're trying to come up with, this is something that the industry is trying to do, is like, is there a better way we can find ways to incentivize people to provide better care, to tie payment to better outcomes. So it hopefully it's sort of a work in progress, but hopefully that'd be a better system.
No, because it's a completely wrong objective function.
Yeah. So that was part 2 of our series on healthcare costs. And we will go with part 3 next.